freedom. Oh, freedom, freedom. Oh, freedom. Oh, freedom over me. Over me. Yeah. And before I be a slave, I'll be buried in my own grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
Since before the 18th century, African Americans and other people of color have been enslaved. Seen as less than and had little to no opportunity to succeed. In 1830, Virginia General Assembly forbid the teaching of African Americans free or enslaved, also known as the Anti-Literacy Laws. The anti-literacy laws prevented over 90% of African Americans from learning to read or write. States throughout the South passed these laws forbidding citizens to teach slaves to read or write. This was a punishable offense. Slave people learned to read or write through other literate slaves. Sometimes masters and mistresses were willing to teach slaves in defiance of the law. Former slave Frederick Douglass was taught the alphabet in secret at the age of 12 by his master's wife. As he grew older, he took charge of his own education, obtaining and reading newspapers and books in secret. He would often quote that knowledge is the pathway from slavery to freedom. And that's exactly how whites and slave owners saw education for African Americans.
And go home to my Lord and be.
In 1862, Lincoln emancipated all slaves.
And before I be a slave, I'll be buried.
As a result, America became one of the most legally, racially segregated societies in the world. The most devastating effect of segregation and slavery was the denial of education for the African American community. As a part of Reconstruction, Congress established the Freedmen's Bureau in 1865. With the help of missionaries, the Freedmen's Bureau worked to establish schools. Teachers taught up to 50,000 students of all ages in 4,000 schools across the South. Most teachers were women of color. These women demonstrated commitment and dedication to help their people advance in society. In 1896, the Supreme Court ruled in Plessy v. Ferguson that racially segregated public facilities were legal. Separate but equal doctrine would stand for the next 6 decades. The ruling constitutionally sanctioned laws banning African Americans from sharing the same buses, schools, and other public facilities, also known as the Jim Crow laws. Brown v. Board of Education claimed that schools for black children were not equal to the white schools, and that segregation violated the so-called Equal Protection Clause. May 17, 1984, court decided that African Americans were deprived of equal protection of the laws guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. In May of 1955, the lower federal courts directed district courts and school boards to proceed with desegregation of schools.
Show up. If I got anything to do with it, they won't show up. Well, I think it's a breaking point of the school integration. I just don't feel that they have a right to go to school.
With the growing number of blacks that could read and write, whites became uneasy. Southerners refused to accept blacks as citizens and respect the rights that they have been given. Little Rock Nine was a group of black students who were enrolled at a formerly all-white high school in Little Rock, Arkansas in September 1957. September 25th, the Little Rock Nine attended their first full day of classes. Their attendance at an all-white high school was a test for the Brown v. Education court ruling. Elizabeth Eckford, one of the Little Rock Nine, arrived alone to Central High. She had to walk through hostile screaming crowds of white students and adults screaming derogatory names at her and spitting on her. The first day of class for the Little Rock Nine, the governor called in Arkansas's National Guard to block the black students' entry into the high school. September 20th, Judge Davis ordered the guards to be removed.
Weeks lined the sidewalk here in front of the high school under orders to keep the colored students out have been replaced now from their orders to comply with the law.
And before I'll be a slave, I'll be buried.
Got no business out here. It's our school, not theirs. They are down.
Southerners refused to accept blacks as citizens and respect the rights that they have been given, and they refused to accept the education of African Americans. Acts of violence against African Americans being educated were repeated throughout the South. November 14, 1960, Ruby Bridges, at the age of 6, integrated an all-white elementary school in the South. All young African American children had to pass the entrance exam. Only 6 Ruby Bridges was one of the 6 children that passed and became the first to integrate. Ruby Bridges continues to tell her story today. Here's a segment of Ruby herself telling us her experience of walking into an all-white elementary school on her first day.
They were screaming and shouting and chanting 2, 4, 6, 8. We don't want to integrate.
The mothers of downtown New Orleans screaming at a Negro child as she entered the William Franz Elementary School, first in the city to be integrated.
As soon as Ruby entered the school, parents rushed in to pull their kids out of class.
I'll be buried in my own grave and go home to my Lord and be free.
African Americans found ways to build and establish schools for their people. The effort to educate people coming out of slavery is unmatched in the history of mankind. It was amazingly accomplished under circumstances of oppression, and it's even more remarkable that it was accomplished by poor and uneducated people of color. All of these events, from slaves being educated to Lincoln emancipating slaves, the Little Rock Nine, and Ruby Bridges, gave African Americans a chance today to be equal in the education system.